Welcome back to another episode of Tim's Garage. So after I got the car all running and I made all the upgrades, I still have not gotten the car to the dyno because I'm not entirely happy with how the car runs. It runs fairly well, but I know that there's a little bit more in the car, and what I've been experiencing is some higher RPM stumbling. And it's not a horrible stumble, but it sounds to me like back in the day when I would run a car and it was running just a little bit too rich. It was like the spark plug was being washed out with fuel. So what I'm thinking is that in this particular case, the car has a spark issue where the spark plugs they're not capable of igniting the charge at high boost, and high boost to me is 23 psi, and it's causing some issues. Now, I've run the same set of spark plugs from when I installed everything and went through all kinds of tuning issues, too fat, too lean, and it may very well be that the spark plugs are spent and it just needs a new set of spark plugs. But instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through kind of what I've done so far and then give you guys an idea of what I'm going to move forward with and see whether or not it works. So initially what I did is I went out and I did a little dyno run, or basically a data log run, and I used two devices. I used something called my HP Tuners MVP2 device here, and I was able to capture a data log on the car to see whether or not it would show up with any of the burbling, I guess, of the car, because it just doesn't sound clean. And I also went through and used something called a draggy device. And the draggy device I've had for a while, and this is kind of the first opportunity I've had to be able to use it. And the draggy device, when I went out and ran with the draggy device, it's a pretty simple device. It connects to an iPhone app, and it's magnetic. So because it's magnetic, it can just stick to the car. So you just stick it to a trunk panel or a hood panel if they're not aluminum. And then you have the ability to have a GPS device that is an accelerometer, and it'll record how your vehicle works. Now, what I wound up doing is taking it out, and I got some results initially just so that I can compare before and after as best as I can. And I went out and I made about 9 runs with the car out on a toll road near here that is kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and I had the ability to be able to do that. And what I found is that it's kind of difficult to launch the car because the back tires start to break loose. But after several launches, I started to figure out just how much to load the converter on the car to be able to launch it and minimize the amount of wheel spin, but still have the car launch pretty well. So the best times that I managed were, I managed an average of between 1360 and 1380 in a quarter mile time. So that's 13.6 to 13.8 seconds. With the best time of, I think it was a 13.61. As a quarter mile time, with a 0 to 60 time of only about 5.3 seconds. And I know these cars are capable of getting down into the 5 seconds and sometimes a little bit less with the big wheel turbo. So what I'm going to do is I've got that data log, and I'll share both the 1360 evidence of the 1360 quarter mile time, and I'll also share the 5.3 second 0 to 60 time. And with those shared, I'm going to use that as kind of my benchmark. And now, and I will admit that both of those instances had dramatic wheel spin all the way through first gear. So it was, and part way into second gear. So it is a little difficult to get the car to hook up down low to try and get something that's repeatable. But the key point is acceleration beyond 60 miles an hour. And I want to see if I can improve that. And the draggy does a good job of measuring acceleration over time. So what the plan is that I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and I'm going to put in fresh spark plugs. And apparently these are the only spark plugs you should run in an LNF. Otherwise you wind up with issues with the computer and the spark not working well enough. I don't know what I'm going to gap them at yet, because I'm going to pull the plugs out of the car and see what they're gapped at. And I may tighten them up by about 1/1000th of an inch. So I believe they're gapped at 32 or 34 thousandths of an inch, but whatever they're gapped at, I'm gonna tighten them up by 1/1000th of an inch. And then the second thing I'm gonna do, since I've got it all apart, is I decided fresh coils. And now the car only has 12,000 miles on it, so the coils are essentially not used, but they are old. They're from 2007, and they may or may not still be functional. So what I did is I went out and I got some what are purported to be performance coils. And these performance coils are unique to the LNF. They're from a company called ZZP Performance or ZZ Performance. And, you know, they're very nice looking coils. The coils themselves, they seem to be fairly high quality in how they're made. But the whole point is everyone online indicates that these don't do any good. They don't really improve anything. So this is going to be an opportunity for me to document as best I can whether in fact these do anything. And my hope is that I'll be able to validate whether or not these improved any performance on my car with my tune. Now I want to stress that if it works for me, that's great. It made a difference on my car. But if these don't work for me, that doesn't mean that they're not any good. It just means that whatever the issue is I'm having with my car, this wasn't the correction. But because I want to put different coils in my car, I'm going to put these in. So with that said, what I'll do is move on to the actual act of disassembling the car and swapping out both the spark plugs and the coils. And I'll go through that step by step. Okay. So many people, when they're having difficulty and they haven't worked on these cars before, they look at that engine cover and they go, how the heck am I going to get that off? And you hear online people say, just pull it off. Well, the reality is it does just pull off, but there's a couple of considerations. Number one, the turbo cars have 4 pins that hold it on, and the 2.4 cars have 3 pins that hold it on. And those pins run from the engine up into rubber grommets that are located in the corners of this on a turbo car. The challenge is because that rubber gets old and it gets heat cycled, at some point it gets really, really hard and it's not flexible anymore. And it becomes very difficult to pull this off on some of the older, higher mile cars. So one tip that you might want to try is if you're going to be working on the car, try not to pull this off when the car's cold. Warm it up, have the car warm so those little rubber bushings are slightly soft, and you have the ability to be able to pull that off fairly easy. Because mine's, pretty low miles, it just pops off pretty easily. Literally, it just pops off easy. You see how it's just popping off really, really easily? Okay, so when we pull this off now, I've got all 4 of the pins off, and you can see the rubber grommets that are inside the lid. Those rubber grommets are what hold it on to these 4 pins. There's a pin here, there's a pin here, there's a pin here, and there's a pin here. Those are the pins that hold on this cover, and it's really easy to remove this cover if you know where the pins are, and you understand that you can do it when it's warm. Makes it a little bit easier for that rubber to give and be able to remove. Because it is just plastic, it'd be pretty easy to break that plastic off, especially this front corner right here. You can see that it's just a little tiny little brace on this corner, and it's quite likely that this front corner pin on the right hand side here, that may break out of here fairly easy if you're not careful. So be gentle with them and just make sure the car's a little bit warm. Okay, so now that we've got the cover off, you can see what's here is the sound deadening mat. And just a quick point for those people that put in the cooling system check valves. Those check valves are located right here. There's one in this little pipe right here. There's a check valve here, and then there's another check valve right here down where it exits off of on top of the radiator. So there's 2 check valves. Both of those lines are the lines that run to the overflow tank, but just as a tip. Now, to remove this particular heat shield, it's extremely fragile. And I don't recommend, removing it just for the sake of removing it. And in fact, on mine, I've cracked it a little bit over here on the last time that I removed it when I checked and changed the spark plugs when I first got the car running. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you remove everything that's potentially going to be in the way of it. So these little pins here need to lift up, and that allows that front hose coming from the turbo to be moved out of the way. You want to remove these clips here on top of the coil, and to remove those clips, you can see there's a little tab that's located right here. You simply push that tab down, and then the clip undoes itself. Maybe this one here will make a little noise when I do it. So you just push down right here. You hear that little click, and the tab just comes off. Same here, you push here, comes off, push here, comes off. Now, Now that you have all of the clips undone, it is a little bit of a challenge to get this wire out of the way. And there's a little clip that pushes into the cylinder head on this side. I'm not exactly certain what the easiest way is to get that off, though. Okay, there we go. All right, let's see if I can get that to come out nicely. Okay, so in pulling this one last wire tie clip out, it just is a push pin that goes into a threaded hole, so it bites in there pretty tightly. And the challenge is it takes quite a bit of effort. Now, if you can grab the clip down low on the surface, you can see that, here, I'll spin it up so you can see. So this is what the little Christmas tree clip looks like. And you want to make sure that you try and pull that out carefully. You don't want to break the wire tie and then not have the ability to secure that cable back to the same spot on the cylinder head. You're simply going to pull this over out of the way. There's 2 more clips that need to be undone. These are the cam actuator clips. And I'm looking at these to see how these undo. I think I want to say these pop up like so. Yep, this pops up. And this one pops up. Okay. And then once those pop up, I think this little gray clip comes out of the way and the whole clip comes off. Let's just see if that clip comes out. There we go. Okay, so you pull this little gray clip up first until it gets to the detent, and then you press on the little black part, and it'll, so right here on this portion of the thing, once that little tab is pulled all the way up, this gray is pulled up all the way to the top, you can then depress the black pin, and you simply push that pin in and pull up at the same time. And it's a little tough to get that to undo, but it's working. Just not, there we go. All right, now there's 2 different clips and you need to make sure they go back on the same sensors. So there's a purple one, and there you see there's a gray and a purple. The purple one goes on the black, the gray one goes to gray. So the easiest to remember is gray goes to gray, and that gives you the ability to be able to pull this little harness out of the way. Now, the hardest part is to be able to take the oil cap off. I don't like setting things on here because it may damage the screen. So I always set things off to the side. Now, let's see how hard this is going to be to pull this little cover up without damaging it more than I already have. So this little cover hopefully lifts straight up for the most part. We can get everything out of the way. Okay. We want to be very careful or you'll damage the darn thing. It's extremely fragile. It's just cardboard. You want to make sure you get as much of it up and out of the way. And when it comes to changing spark plugs on this car, this is the hardest part of the job. There we go. So we've got the insulated cover off, and we've got everything exposed, and we can now just change the coil packs and the spark plugs fairly easily. You can see all the coil packs are exposed right there. All right, so I'll come back once I get the wrenches and tooling to be able to take the coil packs out. Okay, so now that we've got the sheltered cover off, I'm just going to actually put the oil cap back on just for now, just to make sure we don't wind up with any debris falling into the engine. Take a 10mm socket and ratchet, and just simply undo this bolt. And once you have that bolt undone, you can simply remove the bolt. And actually, I think I'll crack all of them loose and do that, all of them at one time. Okay. Okay, and then the last one. Okay, so I've got all the bolts out from the coil packs. So now all we're going to do is we're going to just simply grab the coil packs and tug them out, which is pretty easy. They just come out, just pulling straight up. Give it a little twist, you hear the little pop, And there's one of the factory coil packs removed. So I'd like to keep these in the order that they came out. So I'm just going to loosen them. And then I'm going to get a marker and I'm going to mark them all on the cylinder that they came out. So that being said, all the coil packs are removed. And now I'll start to remove the spark plugs. 1. And we'll go 2. We'll go 3. And we'll go 4. There we go. They're all marked using a little pen. Now I can pull them all out. I don't have to worry about where they go back in case for whatever reason the performance parts that I go to put in, I can put everything back exactly as it came apart. Okay, so I've got a 5/8 socket on an extension. I'm assuming it's 5/8. Hopefully that is the correct size. And let's just check. Yep, 5/8 it is. So the sockets are 5/8. I'm just gonna and make sure that when you put spark plugs in, that you definitely use NECs on the threads. We're putting a metal plug into an aluminum cylinder head, and the galvanic reaction that occurs there can create some real problems for you if you try to get these out in the future. And the last thing you want is those threads to gall and then create a problem for you. Okay, so I've got them all loose. I'm going to move them the rest of the way by hand. I'm going to number each of the plugs as I pull them out. So I want to pull the plugs out, and I'll do them one at a time, and then I'll use a magnet to be able to pull that plug out of the bore. And this magnet's got a little dirt on it. All right, so now that I've got the plugs loosened using a 5/8 socket, and these are this spark plug socket is an older socket that I've had, so it's lost the little neoprene piece that holds the spark plug in. You can buy sockets that have like a little neoprene piece inside them. When you push them onto the spark plug, they hold the spark plug. I really should have one, but I don't. So I do it the old school way. I simply put the spark plug socket on there. I make sure it's loose. And then I will take a magnet, go down, grab the spark plug, and, oh, maybe I didn't loosen it enough. Well, clearly I didn't loosen it enough. Okay. Okay, that should be loose enough now. There we go. So there's cylinder number 1. Oh, and I marked them when I put them in. You can see that plug looks like it's burning pretty dark. So I'll put all the spark plugs together in the order, and I'll lay them out, and we can have a really good look at these plugs and see whether maybe that might be part of the problem with the high RPM burbling sound that I hear under wide open throttle. So I'll pull the other spark plugs out, and then we'll have them all laid out on the bench. Okay, so now that we got the spark plugs and coils out, I actually did a little bit of research to figure out kind of where we're at with what we've got. And what I found out is that the present spark plugs, the spark plugs that I had in the car that I was doing all the data logging in, and I'll put an image in the video of this, but these spark plugs were gapped from 1, 2, 3, and 4, cylinder 1, 2, 3, and 4. We had a 33 thousandths of an inch gap in 1, a 34 thousandths of an inch gap in 2, and a 34 thousandths of an inch gap in 3, and a 33 thousandths of an inch gap in 4. Now, when I installed these plugs, I was told just install them because the electrodes are so fragile that we don't want to take a chance on damaging anything. So I just took the spark plugs out of the box and installed them. And the replacement spark plugs, if you'll come closer again here, the replacement spark plugs that I used look kind of like these. So I have 5 spare spark plugs that I'm going to be replacing with. And you'll notice the first replacement plug is a 33-inch gap, 33 thousandths, 33 thousandths, 34 thousandths, 34 thousandths, and 34 thousandths. So these spark plugs come gapped between 33 and 34. Now, the interesting thing is I also saved my original spark plugs that were in the car. And the original spark plugs, I pulled them out. They had, at the time, about 9,000 miles on them. And you can see each of the spark plugs is gapped at 32 thousandths of an inch very consistently. In fact, a very tight and snug 32 thousandths of an inch. So clearly, one of the challenges I had is that the spark plugs that I had in there were gapped between 1 and 2 thousandths of an inch too much. Now, you wouldn't think that that would be a big deal on a car. But because these cars, under the increased boost that we have, that boost actually makes it difficult for the spark to ignite the fuel charge. So if you've got too large of a gap, it can actually blow the spark out when it's under boost. So what I'm seeing is, one of the first things that's going to be a correction for the problem that I've got is tightening the gaps up on the replacement plugs and tightening them all up to a tight 31 to 32 thousandths of an inch. So that's going to be what I'm going to do. I'll put a 15 and 16 thousandths of an inch gauge together, and I'll likely use that as a way to test them. And what I did is, if you don't have a 33 thousandths of an inch gauge, so what I wound up doing is these are old cylinder head valve lash feeler gauges that I used back in the day. So this one here is 32 inches, but it goes from 32 to 30 to 28, and I don't have a really good resolution, or a 35. So it goes from 35 to 32 to 30. So what I do have, though, is I have a 16 and a 17 thousandths of an inch gauge. And by using those two gauges and pulling them together, I can measure a 33 thousandths of an inch gap. And when I do that in these particular gauges, this 32 thousandths or 33 thousandths of an inch, it will not fit in between there. And that's the factory gauge. However, the 32 thousandths of an inch feeler gauge fits in, but it's very snug. You can see that it's actually in there, but it's very snug. I'll pull it out. So 32 thousandths of an inch is what these are gapped to from the factory, and 32 thousandths of an inch seems to be what this likes. Now, as an upgrade, I'm going to be upgrading the coils anyways, because I've got it all apart and I've got the ZZP coil, so I'll be installing those. But it was really interesting to look at the spark plugs and see what the difference is. The second thing I noticed, and I'm not sure if this will pick up in the image, but I ordered 4 spark plugs, and one of the spark plugs came looking like this one. And I don't know if you can pick it up in the video there, but this is quite silver compared to the bronzish color on the other 4. So I had one laying on my shelf, that was this one, and it happened to look like these. So I'm going to wind up running these 4 just because they all look the same. But it's really curious that one of them comes that looks different. I don't quite understand why that is, but whatever it is, the coating or the plating or whatever, just make sure you use an anti-seize coating on it. Now, the last thing on the spark plugs and reading the spark plugs is when we look at cylinder number 1 and cylinder number 1, this one in this hand here, this is my factory spark plug and was on the factory tune, okay? Now this is the spark plug after me jacking around and trying to get the tune right and messing around with fueling and having it too rich and too lean. Look at how that spark plug looks. You can tell that the spark plug on the left is absolutely unacceptable. Carboned up, running way too rich, and it needs to look more like the tan color that's in the spark plug on the left. So one of the things I'll be doing when I put these new spark plugs in is making darn sure I've got the tune set up now that everything is kind of debugged, and I'll make sure that I've got, you know, a proper tune running. Now all 4 of the spark plugs that came out are all very dark. You can tell that they're all running way too rich. Every single one of them way too rich. So we'll go ahead and make sure I get that tune done correct. All right, so I'll come back when we're getting ready to install the spark plugs, and I may video re-gapping the new ones to get them down to the 32 thousandths of an inch. Okay, so in tightening these up, you know, I want to move them down to a really nice snug 32, and it's such a small amount. So it's super loose. You can see that that's a really loose 32 gap. You got to be very, very gentle with these because that little electrode right there is super fragile. I don't know if you can see that little electrode right there, but it's super fragile. You want to make sure that you don't damage that. So for me, it's a little crude the way I do it, but I literally take the spark plug, I hold it firmly, and I give it very gentle taps, and that's how I'm trying to clean up and tighten that little gap. And there we go. Oh, it's a little snug. A little bit more. And we'll just tap it. I'll test it again. Oh, super tight. Now let's just see if the 31 thousandths combined will fit in there. Yep, 31 fits in. 32 is super tight. There we go. We got a 32 thousandths gapped spark plug. So I'm gonna leave that one there. I've got one more. Actually, I'll do both spark plugs. I have two more to do. And when I get all of these adjusted down to the 32 range, then I'll go ahead and start reinstalling them. Okay, now that we've got the spark plugs all ready to go, as I mentioned before, the very last thing you want to do is put metal into aluminum without any kind of anti-seize. So what I've got is some Permatex aluminum anti-seize lubricant. And what this does is this allows us to put something on the threads that'll prevent the threads from galling once they're threaded back into the factory cylinder head. So you simply put a little bit on the side there. That's how I do it. I just run a little bit on the side, so you get it all the way around the spark plug, and then it works its way in when you thread it in. So you do each of the spark plugs around the bottom, and you know you want to be careful not to get it on your fingers, because this is just like urethane. You get it on your finger, next thing you know it's in your ear and on your left knee. And you don't know how it got there. So anti-seize is just one of those things that gets everywhere. Okay, there we go. We'll do this one. And now I've got all the spark plugs gapped properly to 32 thousandths of an inch, back to what the factory was. And it may be that I wind up taking this apart because 32 thousandths of an inch might still be a little too large. But they're all gapped to 32 thousandths of an inch. The gapping that came from the manufacturer for these spark plugs was just a little too large. So at 33 to 34 thousandths of an inch, that may have been the problem all along with me with the higher levels of boost, with the engine running just a little bit on the odd side, having a little bit of blowout on the spark. Okay, so each one is done. Now I'm going to take the magnet. I'm going to hold the spark plug with a magnet from the top, like so. I'm going to drop it down into the cylinder very carefully. I'm going to slide a screwdriver down beside this and hold it in the bore so I can pull the magnet off. But this allows you to set it down into the spark plug hole without dropping it. The weight of the spark plug, if you drop it into the hole, can actually tighten the gap up by 1 to 2 thousandths of an inch. That's bad. We've got them each set for 32 thousandths of an inch. I want to make sure that they stay at 32 thousandths of an inch. So I will go ahead and install these. I'm going to drop them down into the hole, and maybe I'll just show that. I'll drop this one down into the hole, and then I'll get myself, this one was numbered for number 1, so I'm going to put this one down at number 1. We'll get it all the way down, drop it right down into the hole, and sometimes you're lucky, and the magnet, you're able to rotate the spark plug enough that it'll pull off, and that one did. It stayed in. So I was fortunate enough I didn't need to get a screwdriver to drop it in there to return it. I'm going to grab number 2. Do the same thing with number 2. So we'll drop number 2 down in there, drop it straight down into the hole nicely, and then see if there's a way to turn it a little bit, maybe get the first thread to stay so I can get the magnet off. Yep, very fortunate, but that's 2. So that's how I'm going to wind up putting all of them in. Okay, so now we got all the spark plugs installed. I'm going to simply torque them down to 15 pound-feet. You can just hear the little click in the torque wrench. There we go. And it's an old school torque wrench, so it has a click. It doesn't have the beep like the new ones. So you can feel it in the torque wrench, but it may not be all that audible. Okay, so I've got that done now. There's one point to note. When I looked up in the manual, the actual spark plug gaps it calls for are 45 thousandths of an inch. Everyone that I've talked to, when you have increased levels of boost, or even with the stock car, the spark plug gaps were way too wide, and they were tightening them down to 28 and 30 thousandths of an inch. So I've set all the spark plug gaps to 32 thousandths of an inch, a nice tight 32 thousandths. So 32 thousandths gauge barely fits in, it's super snug, but a 31 thousandths fits in and slides in fairly easily. So it's right in that range of between 31 and 32 thousandths of an inch. And the goal is to have something that's repeatable. The last spark plugs that came out ranging from 33, 2 were 33, 2 were 34, and one was, that one of the 34s could very well have been a 35 thousandths of an inch. We want to make sure that I've got it consistent. So they're all set at 32. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go about installing the coil packs, and I'm going to put a little anti-seize on those bolts as well. And we'll be able to just plug it all back in and it'll be ready to go. Okay, so installing the coils, one of the things it calls for is a little bit of dielectric grease to go around the actual seals. So I have here some CRC dielectric grease. It's fairly inexpensive and it's worthwhile using it. Comes out, discharges just with a little bit of pressure. It's all under pressure inside the tube. What I do is I put a little squirt on it, and I use a rag, and I just wipe it around the coil pack just to make sure that we've got like a nice layer of this dielectric grease, and we make sure that it's going to seal up nicely. I've also put a little bit of anti-seize on the bolt location, and now we're simply going to insert the coil pack. I'm going to start on cylinder number 4. I'm just going to set it in. We're going to just drop the coil pack down all the way, and there we go. It's fully seated, and now all I need to do, whoops, I got a little bit of mess on there. So all I need to do now is put the bolts down, and they're going to be tightened down to 89 inch-pounds. So I'll insert each of those, and then I'll come along and I'll torque them all down to 89 inch-pounds. Okay, so now that I've got the coils dropped into the hole and I've snugged the bolts all the way down, I've just snugged them so that they're tight. Now I've got this set to 89 inch-pounds. I'm just going to go through and tighten them to their 89 inch-pounds. And if you don't have a torque wrench that can do inch-pounds, they're not very expensive, but it sure saves snapping bolts off. I would highly recommend that you go and buy one. They're very affordable. This one's a Tecton torque wrench, very inexpensive. I bought it off Amazon. I want to say it was like $40 or $50, but it's worthwhile to have something like this for some of the small bolts. Okay, so this is all done. I'm going to put the rest of it all back together, but functionally, all I have to do is put the insulated panel back on. And once I've got the insulated panel back on, I will plug in all the cables, and then I will reinstall the upper cover, and that's it. We are done. We have fresh spark plugs, a fresh set of coil packs, and I'll be ready to go data log the car again and see whether or not it's going to work. I do know that I'm going to have a really hard look at how rich the car is running, and make sure that I have it lean out properly, because it's running way too rich, and that needs to be leaned out. There's a lot more power that can be found by running it just a little bit leaner, but you want to run that fine line between too lean and generating a bunch of heat and causing component failure. Okay, so I took the car out after I had it all put back together. I plugged in all the harnesses, and I left the engine cover and all the other things off so that I had the ability to be able to just quickly access the spark plugs. And the great news is a couple of things. The first thing is, it looks like the high RPM miss is gone. Tightening the gaps up to 32 thousandths of an inch, and I may tighten the gaps up a little bit more, but tightening the gaps up to 32 thousandths of an inch, and in conjunction with the ZZP coils, has created zero misfire. The car pulls super strong all the way to 6,800 RPM. It feels really strong. It actually has a high RPM pull now instead of it laying down or becoming lazy after about 5,000 RPM. So I'm very excited by that. The net result was I wound up taking it out and running, and I went from a 1364 down to a 1331. So a 13.3 quarter mile time just by changing the plug gaps and changing out the coils. That's using my little draggy, and it's down now to a 5.10 to 60 time, which is pretty good. It's still a tire roasting 0 to 60 time, so clearly there's more to be had if I put some stickier tires on it and prevent the wheel spin. I'll probably be able to put a little bit more power down to the ground and actually move the car. So the best I could do was take it out and try it, and a couple of things I found is that after coming back and running it, I went and looked at the spark plugs, and I pulled a spark plug out just to inspect it, and it turns out that the spark plug now is a light tan and is still a tiny bit rich, but it's not as rich as it was. So we've got a nice tan color on the ceramic there, on the porcelain on the spark plug. So with that light color, that's about where you want it to be. And I didn't pull it over. And ideally, when you check spark plugs, you're supposed to put a fresh set of spark plugs in, do a quarter mile pull with the car, and then shut it down, pull the spark plugs out, and look at them instantly. I didn't do that. I drove it there, drove it back, and then I pulled the spark plug out and looked at it, and it's still nice and tan. It's certainly not black and ugly like the last ones. So the last plugs must have gotten fouled when I was messing around with all the tuning. So I'm happy with the tune. It's going to work. Now, I did wind up with a challenge. In running the car, once the car got hot, after 2 or 3 runs, it went from 1330s to a 1350. And I'll show a 1350 example. And what the car was doing, I went back and looked at the data log, and the car, once it got hot, in order to save the transmission, it was pulling 1500 RPM out of the car before it would grab the next gear. So you can imagine in first gear, flooring it, taking all the way to the end of first gear, grabbing second really hard, but then third gear, it would literally shut the car down. It closes the throttle and pulls the throttle back in HP tuners, and then it grabbed the second gear at 5500 or third gear at 5500 RPM. That doesn't help you with a quarter mile time, and even doing that, it was still getting 1350s. So I've got a little bit more work to do to figure out a way to keep the transmission cool and to look into, what is causing the computer in the car to pull the throttle out to, I guess, basically save the transmission because it's hot. So a couple other little issues, but I'm working through them. Super happy with how this turned out. Can't wait to get the thing all back and running really well. But the tune seems to be pretty good now. The fueling seems to be okay, and the high RPM miss or the laydown that I had or the burbling sound, gone. Thing runs super clean through the entire RPM range. So when I go and start working on the transmission to cool it down, I'll do that in another one of these episodes. But for now, that's it from Tim's Garage. I hope you have a great weekend. Please like and share if you like the video, and by all means, subscribe.